And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. It is a great honor today to have on the Indiana State Comptroller, Elise Nieshalla. Elise, thank you for joining the podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Josh. It's wonderful to be with you and your listeners.
So I've been looking forward to this for some time. The big idea for this podcast episode is to talk about the national debt. And I know it's one of those things as Americans, we see those national debt clocks. We know it's going to impact us, and it's going to impact the next generations. And on this podcast, we talk about a number of various moral issues, the created order, but financial responsibility is a biblical issue as well. And so I wanted to dive into that. The big idea being Indiana is a great turnaround story. And then Elise is also speaking into this at the national level as well. So I wanted to talk about where we are and what are some things that we can do as concerned citizens as we think about the national debt. Well, Elise Nieshalla, as I mentioned, is the Indiana State Comptroller. If you're not familiar with that term, in a sense, kind of the chief financial officer. She earned a bachelor's degree from Oral Roberts University and a master's degree from Indiana University, where she also taught as an adjunct faculty member in the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. She resides with her husband, Chris, in Zionsville, where they have raised their 4 children. She has an extensive bio. I won't go into all of it, but has served in public life at the county level, now at the state level, in a number of capacities, is a hardworking entrepreneur, and I'm just so grateful that God called her into the space that she is in. As we get started, Comptroller Nieshalla, if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself, if there's anything important that I might have missed, and then maybe just one recent success story. Maybe something that you've been working on that is of note.
Certainly. Well, thank you, Josh. It's an honor to be with you and your listeners. And truly, Indiana, as you mentioned, is a turnaround state. If you remember 20 plus years ago, we had a great amount of debt and we had cash flow problems. And a gentleman by the name of Governor Mitch Daniels came along, and he was the Blade, known as the Blade out in Washington, D.C., under President Bush as the director of the Office of Management and Budget. And then he came here to the great state of Indiana and served in that same capacity of really bringing necessary cuts. He was Indiana Doge before any of us had an idea of what Doge meant. And he had the fortitude to see the cuts that must be made and the innovative ideas that had to be brought to bear to change the trajectory for the state of Indiana and put us on a path to fiscal responsibility. And now, 20 years later, we enjoy being the 4th lowest debt per capita state in the country. We have healthy cash reserves, a balanced budget, even a balanced budget amendment in our state's constitution as of 2018. And we have a AAA credit rating from all 3 of the rating agencies. So it is good to be a Hoosier. And then you asked, just a thing or two that we've done here recently that we're really proud of. And that is continuing with the efforts of government efficiency here. We brought on a new higher technology form of timekeeping, a timekeeping system, as well as we've enhanced the technology for our financial record keeping. And these are all improvements that decrease the amount of time and, most importantly, decrease the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse that's possible. And we are looking at taking it a step forward here in the in the near future of bringing AI on board for accounts payable to, again, assist us in that good work and to be able to review the vast amounts of information and bills that come across this office's desk to pay, to find any abnormalities, and then to go investigate those further to further our stewardship responsibility for taxpayer dollars to the very best of our ability.
Just 2 quick points of follow-up, and I am blessed every time I hear about the state's financial position. I know that has been a long-term project, and then you now are currently the steward of that. I remember meeting with Representative Thompson and now retired Representative Cherry, and they pulled out a budget from about 20 years ago, and then they had the budget now, and they were just so proud of all that they had done over that period of time. And we just, as a group of church leaders, profusely thank them for that often overlooked and thankless work of just getting us back on track as a state. And so I know that's taken a lot of time, but that was a great meeting. I wanted to turn just before we dive into a little bit more of the national debt, just to the concept of how you were called into public life and how your faith influences your approach to leadership and policy.
Well, it started a while ago. I ended up in this realm of public policy, certainly I think by the Lord's leading, but I had no idea about that. I went the old-fashioned route. Goodness, this is, 25, 30 years ago. Was looking through the classified ads at the paper, looking for, one of my first jobs out of school, and found this one about, for the state of Indiana and working to support business development here. And it sounded interesting. I went, I interviewed, I got the job, but little did I know that I was smack dab working under the lieutenant governor, and it was a great lesson for me of how important it is for the state of Indiana to have a good tax climate so that we can be a place where businesses can flourish and jobs can be here and plenty for citizens to be able to not only live here but thrive here for their families. So that's how I initially got in, and then I went on to get a master's degree in public affairs, started or helped to start the Hoosier Leadership Series, which is under the same umbrella as your organization of the Indiana Family Institute, and that was a great opportunity back when then Congressmen Pence and Burton and Sandro wanted to start something that, or a leadership series that would take the best practices really of government and bring it to bear to teach those interested in potentially serving and really solidifying why do we believe what we believe as far as our conservative values and principles, and what are they based on, going all the way back to a scriptural foundation. So it was a pleasure to help them get that started. Served with that group for oh goodness, about a dozen years, heading up the tax and fiscal policy part of the program and education policy as far as what we would pass on to each class of participants that came through on an annual basis. And goodness, from there, well, mind you, in this season, I was also the mother of 4 young children, which, wow. Being a mom is the best kind of good hard work there is, and passing on, all that we hold as sacred to our kiddos and making sure they're educated well. And then went on from there to be asked to run for Boone County Council, and did so, ran, fortunately won, and served for 7 years. And then, goodness, was asked to run for state treasurer. We did. We lost by just a little bit. Went back to county government, became president of Boone County, and somewhere along that line, as well as president of the Indiana County Councils Association. So worked statewide on the fiscal side of county government. And then this office of Comptroller was vacated, and am fortunate to have received the appointment from the governor to fulfill 3 years of a 4-year term, and then we'll be running for election in 2026. How's that for the journey?
It's an amazing journey, and I wanted to lean in just a little bit because I know some of this story of just your remarkable testimony of leadership and even how you campaign. And as believers, I think how we engage in the public square is important. Like, we want to see the wins, we want to see policy change. But you ran against our current state treasurer, and as you mentioned, lost by just the slimmest of margins. And I can only imagine how difficult that was. But when this next opportunity came up, my understanding is that the state treasurer is one that recommended you for that role. So just so listeners are clear, your opponent in the campaign knew your character, knew your expertise well enough that he then recommended you. Like that, please, more of that in American public life. And so I just wanted to mention that to listeners, and I appreciate your integrity and your character as you lead in public life. Just briefly asking how, as a follower of Jesus, how does that impact your work in your role?
Well, I understand that I am accountable to the Lord for my attitude, for my actions, for my words. And so I just try to approach it with humility and respect and goodwill and empathy. So I guess that's a standard, that's a high standard, and I just do my best to live by that, certainly by the example that we have in the scriptures of our Lord. And, I also have had some really great examples in my life, like my mom, Cindy Noe, who was a state representative for a dozen years. And towards the end of her service, they redistricted. And her district, because of where she lived, was going to be very difficult to win again. And she went into that race just, Lord, help me do my best as unto you. And we accept the outcome. Well, she lost by 44 votes. So I saw my mom, up close and personal after a dozen years of service in the State House, take a very difficult loss. And she did so with grace. Now it hurt and it was difficult, but she remained true to being positive and got involved in other ways. So I had that example in my life as well. So when that loss came at the state convention, I knew what I had to do. And as a Republican, knowing our duty to get behind the person who wins and support them, it was top of mind. And we didn't know how this was going to turn out. So when the news came, it certainly takes your breath away, and you have to take a moment just to let the reality of that news settle in. Of course, when you've worked so hard for something, and your whole family and your team, it's only natural for some emotion to just come out, right? You shed some tears, you huddle up, you pray, you hug, and then went down to congratulate Treasurer Elliott and just told him that I was behind him 110%. And then so when that call came from him, I think it was within an hour of the news of our former comptroller resigning, to say, Elise, you should really go for the governor's appointment. And I would love to work with you. I'm telling you what, that meant the world. And I'm grateful for the relationships that I built all across this state through that process. With the candidates, there were 4 of us. We've all gone on to do, walk through other doors that opened, and we have really great relationships. Goodness, one of them is our current Republican State Party Chairwoman, Lana Kiesling. So how about that? And Pete Seat has gone on to do great things, representing a conservative voice on a mainstream network. So he's very articulate in getting that message out there. So it's just neat to see what the Lord did with the 4 of us. And, relationships are really, really important, and to honor them and keep them. And so I'm grateful that that's certainly how it's turned out so well.
Yeah, just a couple of points of follow up. First, I'm just blessed by the story, and I imagine listeners, wherever God has placed them in whatever field, understand, disappointment, but I've become convinced in my life that God writes the best stories. So why don't we just let him write ours? And what an example. You mentioned there being some emotion. I imagine a lot of us, we lost, and just graciously walking forward, and then how God opened this door. But I appreciate what you said at the beginning about being accountable to God. Something that I see throughout Scripture is this concept of the fear of the Lord. And it's often mentioned in context of governing officials, as we've talked briefly about before. And that is knowing, more than even just the people of Indiana, that one day you will give account to God for your actions, and that is something that we should highly value in our public servants. And so we're grateful for you there. Well, let's pivot now to the national debt. And I know anybody that's listening, on the treadmill or in the car, oh boy. So the federal debt can feel like a distant and abstract issue sometimes. It's just such a big number. Why should everyday Americans, everyday Hoosiers, why should we care about reducing the national debt?
Of this country depends on it being fiscally solvent. next summer we'll celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But we've got to ask ourselves the question of how can we truly celebrate our political independence if our financial independence is in grave jeopardy? And that's where we are right now. It's a problem that has been mounting over time. Both parties must accept responsibility for the problem and for the solution. And we must get our fiscal house in order, because with $36 trillion of debt, that is a massive burden on the country that we love. And it's mathematically guaranteed that we will face a day of reckoning. And really, that won't be a day of reckoning, but an age of reckoning. If you've got the number one economy in the world that goes bankrupt, and this economy, this country is the beacon of freedom and opportunity for the world, that is a big problem and a day that we never want to see. So we need to get active now. As difficult of a challenge as this will be, to start supporting big time our delegation to Congress and President Trump to tackle the debt, to restore the country's fiscal solvency, to rein in deficit spending, to get us back to a balanced budget as soon as possible, so we have a country to pass on to our children that is going to be able to thrive and maintain itself, versus giving them a fiscal cliff that it's just a matter of time before we all go off. So we gotta avoid that. Yeah. We gotta dig in and do the hard work now.
I was just reflecting some on the story of World War I, because you think of the United Kingdom and just how broad its impact was around the world. And you have World War I, where it achieved massive debt levels, and a lot of its wealth transferred to New York City, to the United States, and then slowly waned off the world stage. So that is one of the lessons I've always taken, that those nations that have some influence, you have to consider that, the national security issues, as you've mentioned in some of your work as well. Could you take just a minute to translate, and I think this may be fairly basic, but what are some of the things that Indiana did that the national, that Congress should consider? And you mentioned the balanced budget amendment. Any other things that perhaps could be learned from Indiana's turnaround that could be applied at the national level?
Well, as you just said, it's all simple, but it is not easy. And I believe that's a quote from Ronald Reagan.
Okay. Yeah.
There are, what did he say? There are simple answers, but they are not easy answers. And so, yes, you just start with the basics of cutting, which we've seen really good strides in that direction. Now we've got to get those cuts that were made through DOGE and through executive orders solidified in law through the legislative process, and continue to look for more cuts that need to be made. And then also, you've got to grow your way out of this problem. And that is a good recipe for dealing with this. You've got a debt to GDP ratio that's never been as high, except for once before, and that's after World War II. We expended a lot of resources to defeat the Nazis and Imperial Japan. And then afterwards, we had a financial recovery during peacetime. And right now, we only have a pandemic that's far in the rearview mirror to show for this vast amount of spending, and really no economic time of recovery in sight. And so that's what we must seize. The debt is a national security threat, because when you have a debt to GDP ratio that's over 100%, we are not in a position of strength. And should a major war break out, it would hasten the upcoming potential bankruptcy of the country. And we cannot stay in that position. We need to shore up our finances so that we are ready and confident when that next challenge comes along, that we have the wherewithal to see it through to victory. And so now is the time, again, to make the cuts, grow our way out of this, get ourselves back on a path to a balanced budget as soon as possible so we stop the bleeding through deficit spending, and then come up with a long-term plan of, where could we be in 2035, 45, 55? Like, look at it as a mortgage. How do we pay this down? We've got to start paying down on the principal as well, and set up our sons and daughters and their children up to inherit an America that is fiscally strong, responsible, and free.
Well, at least what I appreciate so much about you is that you talk about these things, but you're also working on it. You are doing things. And so as not just the state comptroller, you are also serving as the chair of the National Debt Crisis Task Force for state financial officers. So would you explain a little bit about that role and some of the steps you've taken to encourage Congress to get its house in order?
Certainly. So when I came on board as state comptroller, one of the first calls I made was to our Association of State Financial Officers and asked, I'm introduced myself first, of course, but then shared how, hard Indiana has worked to be a turnaround state, right? From a fiscally dark sort of prospect to now we are, a bright light of fiscal responsibility. And as hard as we've worked to be in that position, we are vulnerable to the rapidly dissolving financial position of our country. And I asked, is there an effort for state financial officers, that are coming together to support Congress and our president to tackle these issues? And the response I received was, no, we should have started on something like that probably 20 years ago. And what do you have in mind? So I pitched them on starting a national debt crisis task force and to be very active on this front, and laid out a plan that I thought was reasonable and that we're in a very strong position to speak with a poignant voice on this. And so they got back to me and said, all right, let's do it. And would you chair that task force?
Okay.
So I've been leaning into that ever since. We have been working now for over a year, assembled a group of state financial officers to serve as the executive committee of this task force. And the first job that we set our minds to was to come up with a letter that we would then share with all the members and ask for them to consider signing on to this letter. It was a letter addressed to, then it was President-elect Trump, because it was sent in the end of November of last year, and to every member of Congress, sharing with them that as states' financial officers, that we understand the gravity of the national debt problem, and that we're asking three things of them. One, just spend less next fiscal year than you did in the one prior. And two, get us back to a balanced budget as soon as possible. And three, with unleashing the American economy, come up with a plan for debt reduction. And that letter ended up being signed by 37 state financial officers from 27 states, including the swing states of Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Georgia.
Wow.
The letter was very well received, and the message that we got back was, send us more. We need more support. And in particular, our Indiana delegation communicated with me, thank you, and yes, what more can you do? So now we are teaming up with ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council, a similar association for state legislators. And we're also teaming up with Governor Braun, who is a real, a very serious advocate for the country resecuring its strong financial position. 2 years ago now, he brought forth as a senator U.S. Senate Resolution 600 that called out the national debt for the national security threat it is, and also called out deficit spending as reckless, irresponsible, and dangerous. And his resolution was passed unanimously in the United States Senate, and it was really the first time in a long time that the light of day was showing on this major problem for our country. And I so appreciate what he did and what the U.S. Senate did. So reached out to him and said, Governor Braun, would you consider coming on board with us on this letter and reach out to your fellow governors? And that is in the works.
Oh, wow.
Just getting started. So we've just finalized the draft of the letter. So we are embarking here shortly on reaching out to folks, state financial officers, state legislators, and governors to put together a large contingency of elected officials from the state level to send this letter out here pretty soon to Congress and President Trump, letting them know that we are behind them 110% to restore the country's fiscal solvency. So that's just one item. There are a couple other things I can share with you as well, of tangible ways, of doors that have opened to be able to take this message of support for dealing with the debt and deficit spending to our federal government.
Well, it's incredible. And I did not know about the last piece. And we'll link in the show notes the letter that was sent to Congress. I think it's really important. And just as a citizen, I'm just so grateful that someone is talking about this. And I think we all know in our own household budget meetings, it's always hard to be the person to say, I'm sorry, we can't get that because it doesn't fit. But it is absolutely necessary. And I'm just so grateful that you're playing that role at the federal level, organizing folks nationally to get involved. Now, I know our time is coming to an end. We'll look forward to hearing about some of those other efforts. If you could just maybe briefly, what is the impact of the big, beautiful bill on this? How do you see that impacting the national debt?
Sure. So that bill does a number of things from the standpoint of helping us hopefully grow our way out of this problem. That has got to be a large part of this, to get that debt to GDP ratio down to a manageable level, with the rolling back of regulations, with the unleashing of America's natural resources further. We are such a blessed and rich nation with natural resources that to a large extent have been locked up. So to become not only energy independent, but energy dominant, and to also become mineral independent versus sourcing minerals from nations that are not our friends. Same with energy. That's going to go a long way to helping us grow our way out of this problem. And with that bill having been passed, it is absolutely time to pivot to tackling the debt and the problem of deficit spending. And we are there as financial officers to support Congress and President Trump in having those very necessary discussions, and as they look at how to set a vision and put a plan in place to make America strong financially again.
Yeah. Well, this again is just so encouraging that someone is speaking about this and raising this issue at the national level. As we come to a close, would you have just any encouragement or thought for just the church leader, the committed Christian? Certainly we've talked about the issue of the national debt, but also just how God called you into public life. Anything that you might just share with a fellow believer that wants to impact public life?
Well, in the scriptures, we read about folks who have just said, well, Lord, where do you want me? And wherever we find ourselves, in business, working in the nonprofit world, working in public policy, raising a family, those are all gifts. And just, Lord, help us to be salt and light wherever we find ourselves with the doors that he opens. And so just good to be a part of the body of Christ, and each of us doing our part, and my hats off to each of you in the roles that you play and in the communities and that you can reach in your line of work. And we're all in this together. So
Amen.
I love that picture of the body of Christ and the different roles that we play.
Absolutely. Well, Comptroller Nieshalla, thank you again for taking some time out of your very busy schedule to share with us. It is a great relief to me, I'm sure to others, that you're working on this. We'll keep praying for you, and we'll look forward to seeing additional results from your work. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Josh.